Believing you truly know the person sleeping on the other side of that wall is the most dangerous illusion you will ever entertain. You think the flimsy wood and plaster of a shared apartment can contain the abyss that churns within another soul, but it cannot. Let me tell you about a vision I had. A whisper from the cold ashes of a place that once felt like home. I saw a hallway, just like yours, but the air was thick with the dust of unspoken dread. The doors were not barriers but thresholds to private hells, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of secrets that bled through the varnish like a slow, dark stain. The greatest horror is not a monster from a forgotten tomb, but the one you willingly invite into your life, the one to whom you give a key. You mistake shared rent for shared reality, a common kitchen for common ground. But every night, as you surrender to the vulnerability of sleep, you are merely an audience to a play you cannot see. The sounds you dismiss as the building settling are something else. They are the creaking of a soul under pressure, the rustle of a mask being removed in the privacy of shadows. I have heard the whispers that travel through ventilation shafts, not carrying conversations, but incantations. I have seen the way light from under a closed door can flicker with an energy that is not electrical. You are a guest in the life of a stranger, and you have forgotten the most ancient rule: never assume you are safe in another's territory, especially when they have convinced you it is also your own. The contract you sign, the agreement you make, it is a document of profound naivete. It speaks of rules and boundaries, of notice and respect, but it has no clause for the darkness that clings to a person like a second skin. It cannot protect you from the dreams that leak from their mind into yours, poisoning your rest with images of broken crosses and eyeless crows. It offers no recourse for the sudden bone-deep chill that floods a room when they enter, a cold that has nothing to do with the temperature. You have built a fragile nest next to a predator, and your greatest mistake is believing that its stillness means peace. The quiet ones, they are always the most terrifying, for their screams are happening on the inside, and they are looking for a way to let them out. They will learn your rhythms, your comings and goings, the sound of your breathing as you sleep. They will become a ghost in your own life, a presence so constant you cease to notice it, until the pattern breaks. A misplaced object, a lingering scent that doesn't belong, a reflection in a dark window that seems to hold your gaze a moment too long. These are the first signs, the hairline fractures in the mirror of your perceived reality. And this is where everything changes for you, because you begin to understand that the lease you signed was not for an apartment. It was an invitation for something to study you, to learn the shape of your fears, and to find the perfect moment to wear them like a triumphant crown of thorns. Tonight, we do not speak of ghosts or ancient demons from dusty tomes. We speak of a far more intimate and insidious horror. We will peel back the thin veneer of civility that separates tenant from tenant, and we will gaze into the abyss that stares back from the neighboring room. I will share with you 5 visions, 5 echoes of truth about what happens when the person you share your home with is not what they seem. These are not mere stories. They are warnings, written in the dried blood of broken trust. The first whisper I received was of a young man named Leo, who thought he had found the perfect roommate in a quiet, unassuming artist named Julian. A fatal mistake. Leo was drawn to Julian's silence. In the chaotic symphony of the city, Julian was a pocket of profound quiet. He was an artist, a painter, who worked on vast canvases that were always turned to face the wall. He paid his rent on time, washed his dishes, and communicated mostly through brief, polite notes left on the kitchen counter. For months, it was an ideal arrangement. Leo could focus on his studies, enjoying the solitude that Julian's presence somehow amplified rather than disturbed. But the quiet, it began to change. It ceased to be peaceful and started to feel watchful. It was a heavy, listening silence, the kind that precedes a predator's strike, and it began to gather in the corners of the apartment like cold gray ash. The first anomaly was small, almost laughable. A single sock missing from the laundry. Leo blamed the machine, the universe, his own carelessness. Then a favorite coffee mug vanished from the cupboard, only to be replaced by a similar yet unsettlingly different one. It was the same color, the same size, but the handle felt wrong in his hand, the ceramic colder. He asked Julian about it, who simply shrugged, his eyes never quite meeting Leo's. Julian claimed to have seen nothing. The denials were plausible, but they felt hollow, rehearsed. The apartment, once a sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a stage where objects were props being moved by an unseen hand, and Leo was the only actor who didn't know his lines. Soon, the missing objects became more personal. A photograph of his mother, tucked away in a book, disappeared. A worn-out t-shirt he slept in was gone from his hamper. These were things with no monetary value, only sentimental. They were pieces of him, imbued with memory and meaning. He searched his room, a frantic, desperate excavation, but it was as if they had been erased from existence. He confronted Julian again, his voice tight with an accusation he couldn't quite form. Julian just stood there, his expression a placid mask, and said, "Perhaps you are simply becoming forgetful, Leo. It happens." The words were calm, but underneath them Leo felt a chilling amusement, a dark, gloating secret that made his skin crawl. The true horror began with the sounds from Julian's room. At night, through the thin wall, Leo started hearing a soft, rhythmic scraping. It was a dry, whispering sound like sandpaper on old wood. It would go on for hours, a maddening, persistent friction that grated on his nerves and colonized his dreams. He would lie in bed, sweat beading on his forehead, trying to imagine what could possibly create such a noise. It was accompanied by the faintest scent, a smell like old paper, dried herbs, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely organic, like the smell of a butcher shop after closing. The quiet artist was no longer quiet. He was busy, and his work had begun to infect the very air Leo breathed. One night, driven by a cocktail of insomnia and creeping dread, Leo pressed his ear against the wall. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, and 1,000 times more terrifying. It was as if Julian knew he was listening. Leo held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, he heard a new sound, a soft, wet tearing. It was a delicate, deliberate noise, followed by a faint, sticky squelch. Leo recoiled from the wall, a wave of nausea washing over him. The sounds were incomprehensible, yet his mind raced, painting gruesome pictures in the darkness. What was being torn? What was so wet? He spent the rest of the night huddled in his living room, watching the sliver of light under Julian's door, flinching at every creak of the old building. The paranoia took root and grew like a black mold. Leo started documenting everything. He took pictures of his room before he left for class, trying to catch any subtle changes. He began to suspect Julian was entering his space, not to steal but to observe, to touch his things, to breathe in his scent. He found a single long dark hair, Julian's hair, on his pillowcase one morning. The violation was so profound it felt like a physical assault. The apartment had become a cage, and he was the specimen being studied. He knew he had to see what was inside Julian's room. He had to understand the source of the scraping, the tearing, and the awful, sweet smell of decay that now seemed to permanently hang in the hallway. His chance came when a courier delivered a large, flat package for Julian while he was out. Leo signed for it, his hand trembling. He knew Julian would be gone for at least another hour. It was now or never. The lock on Julian's door was flimsy, an old brass knob that gave way with the skillful application of a credit card. The moment the door creaked open, the smell hit him like a physical blow. It was the scent he'd smelled before, but amplified 100 times, a cloying mix of dust, dried flowers, salt, and something acrid that stung his eyes. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, but what he saw in the gloom made his blood turn to ice. The walls were covered with them. Canvases, dozens of them, but they weren't paintings. They were assemblages, twisted, nightmarish collages, and in the center of each one was an object he recognized. His missing sock stretched and pinned like a biological specimen. His mother's photograph, its eyes scratched out and replaced with black buttons. His favorite coffee mug, shattered and glued into a grotesque mosaic. And his old t-shirt, it was shredded and woven into a sprawling web-like pattern, stained with something dark and viscous. The scraping sound was Julian, meticulously mounting these stolen pieces of his life. The tearing sound was him ripping fabric, paper, photographs. He was creating a museum of Leo, a shrine built from discarded fragments of his existence. On the largest canvas, the centerpiece of this horrific gallery, was a new creation. It was a vaguely human shape, a stick figure effigy, and Julian had just begun to adorn it. Glued to the canvas, arranged in a sickening halo around the figure's head, were clumps of hair. His hair, collected from his comb, from the shower drain, and pinned to the chest, right where the heart should be, was a small, desiccated object. It was leathery and brown, and it took Leo a moment to recognize the shriveled form of a dead mouse he had found in a trap weeks ago and thrown away. Julian had retrieved it from the trash. He was building an idol, a voodoo doll, a golem of Leo, constructed from the refuse of his life. A cold whisper echoed in the chamber of his mind, a voice that was not his own. Every piece of you he takes, he replaces with a piece of himself inside you. Leo backed away, his breath catching in his throat. He saw the package he had signed for lying on the floor. It was from an online occult supplier. He nudged it with his foot, and the packaging tore. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, vials of black liquid, and a set of long, cruel-looking silver pins, the final pieces for the ritual. Julian wasn't just an artist, he was a practitioner. He wasn't just stealing objects, he was stealing his essence, his energy, his very identity, pinning it down piece by piece to that monstrous canvas. He fled the room, not bothering to close the door, and ran from the apartment without looking back. He left everything behind, his clothes, his books, his entire life. He stayed on a friend's couch, ignoring the dozens of placid, questioning texts from Julian. "Are you all right, Leo? You forgot your things." A week later, he convinced a friend to go back with him to retrieve his belongings. They found the apartment unlocked. Julian was gone. All his things, his canvases, his strange materials, vanished. The only thing left in Julian's room was a single long scratch mark on the wooden floor and the lingering, sickly sweet smell. It was as if he had never been there at all. But the horror was not over. Leo tried to move on, to forget the museum of his stolen life, but he couldn't. He started losing things again. Small things at first, keys, a glove. But then he started losing himself. He would forget appointments. He couldn't remember conversations he'd just had. His reflection in the mirror seemed thinner, less substantial, a faded copy. He felt a constant draining fatigue, as if his life force was leaking out of him, being siphoned away to some unknown location. The scraping sound had stopped in the apartment, but now he sometimes heard it in his own head, a faint, dry whisper just behind his thoughts, a constant reminder of the artist and his unfinished masterpiece. He was a ghost in his own body, and Julian, Wherever he was the one holding the pins. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Do you feel the subtle weight of another's gaze even when you are alone? The most terrifying prisons are not made of steel and stone, but of shared walls and polite nods in the hallway. The energy of a person, especially one with a fractured and hungry soul, cannot be contained by drywall. It seeps, it permeates, it stains everything it touches, including the person sleeping innocently on the other side. Think of the spaces in your home, the attic, the basement, the closet. Now think of the space inside the person you live with. Which one is darker? Which one holds more terrifying secrets? The echoes of their true nature are always there. You just have to learn how to listen. I see now another vision, not of stolen things, but of a stolen face. A young woman, we will call her Clara, moved into a bustling city apartment with a roommate she found online. A girl named Sarah, who seemed bright, bubbly, and utterly normal. Sarah was a performer, an actress, she said, always practicing lines, always trying on different personas. Clara found it charming at first, a delightful quirk, but the performance, it never seemed to end. Sarah was a collection of shifting masks, and Clara began to suspect, with a terror that grew like a frozen shard in her gut, that there was nothing underneath. The apartment didn't just have 2 occupants, it had 1,000, and they all wore Sarah's face. The first crack in the mirror appeared during a casual conversation. Clara was telling a story about her childhood, a funny, embarrassing anecdote about falling into a pond. She was animated, using her specific gestures, her unique turns of phrase. Sarah watched her, her head tilted, with an unnerving, analytical intensity. The next day, Clara overheard Sarah on the phone with a friend, recounting a story. It was her story, her anecdote, but Sarah told it as if it had happened to her, mimicking Clara's exact gestures, her vocal inflections, her laughter. It was a perfect, chilling mimicry. When Clara confronted her, Sarah just laughed it off. Oh, it was such a great story. I was just trying it on for size. It's what actors do. But it didn't feel like acting. It felt like theft. This became a pattern. Sarah was a magpie, collecting the shiny, defining pieces of Clara's personality. She would steal her opinions on films, her political stances, her philosophies on life, and regurgitate them to others as her own original thoughts. She began to dress like Clara, buying similar clothes, styling her hair in the same way. It was subtle at first, just enough to be deniable, to make Clara feel like she was the one who was crazy, who was overreacting, but the imitation grew more brazen. She started using phrases and inside jokes that were specific to Clara's family. She was absorbing her, piece by piece, like a psychic predator. The bubbly, charming roommate was an empty vessel, desperately trying to fill herself with the life of another. The true terror, however, was not in the imitation of the living, but in the imitation of the dead. Clara's grandmother had passed away a year prior, a loss that still felt like an open wound. One evening, feeling a wave of grief, she told Sarah about her grandmother, about her kindness, her unique way of humming old lullabies, the specific way she would comfort Clara by stroking her hair. She shared these intimate, sacred memories in a moment of vulnerability. Sarah listened, her eyes wide with a predatory sympathy. That night, Clara was woken from her sleep by a sound. It was a faint, melodic humming coming from the living room. It was her grandmother's lullaby. Clara crept out of her room, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She peered into the darkened living room. Sarah was standing by the window, her back to Clara, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. She was humming the tune perfectly, swaying gently. And then, in a voice that was a cracked, wheezing imitation of an old woman, she began to speak to the empty street below. She was reciting words of comfort, the exact phrases Clara had told her, the phrases her grandmother used to say. There, little bird," the voice rasped. "Everything will be ashes in the morning." Clara watched, paralyzed, as this thing wearing her roommate's skin performed a grotesque seance with a stolen memory. The apartment became a house of cracked mirrors. Every reflection of Sarah seemed to contain a flicker of Clara. When they spoke, it felt like Clara was talking to a distorted echo of herself. Sarah would start finishing her sentences, not in a friendly, knowing way, but with a chilling precision, as if she were reading a script from inside Clara's own mind. Clara started to feel herself disappearing, her own identity becoming diluted, washed out. She would look in the mirror, and for a terrifying, fleeting second, she would see Sarah's eyes staring back at her. The psychic leech was not just copying her. She was replacing her, overwriting the code of her personality with her own empty, desperate programming. Clara began locking her door at night, but it offered no comfort. She felt Sarah's presence seeping through, a constant, silent pressure against the wood. She would have nightmares, not of monsters or ghosts, but of looking down at her own hands and seeing they were not hers. They were Sarah's hands. She would dream she was speaking, but the voice that came out was Sarah's voice. She was being erased, not through violence, but through a terrifying, relentless process of spiritual plagiarism. The most chilling part was that no one else could see it. To their friends, Sarah was just a bit eccentric, a talented actress. They would say, "You two are so alike, you could be sisters," and Clara would just smile, a rictus of terror, as she felt another piece of herself flake away like old paint. The final violation came in the form of a man. Clara had been dating someone, Michael, for a few months. It was the first real happiness she'd felt since moving in. She kept the relationship private, terrified of what Sarah might do with it, but the secret was a fragile shield. Sarah, with her unnerving intuition, found out. She didn't confront Clara. She did something far worse. One evening, when Clara was supposed to be out but came home early, she heard voices from Sarah's room. A man's voice, Michael's voice, and Sarah's voice, except it wasn't. It was a perfect, flawless imitation of Clara's voice, right down to her specific laugh, her sighs, her whispers. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, listening to a phantom of herself being intimate with her boyfriend. She heard her voice telling her secrets, whispering her words of affection. Sarah wasn't just stealing her mannerisms anymore. She was stealing her life, her relationships, her most private moments. She was living a better, more successful version of Clara's life, right under her roof. Clara finally understood. Sarah wasn't an actress. She was a doppelganger, a void that could only find substance by devouring the substance of others. She was a living ghost, and she was haunting Clara's life, not from the grave, but from the room next door. She burst into the room. Michael looked up, his face a mask of confusion, and Sarah just looked at her, and for the first time, the mask dropped. The bubbly, charming face dissolved, and underneath was something cold, ancient, and utterly empty. There was no anger, no surprise, just a flat, reptilian hunger, and in that moment, Clara saw the truth in her eyes. "You have nothing that I cannot take." Michael, confused, saw only a roommate drama. He left. Clara was alone with the creature that had been methodically dismantling her reality. That night, she packed a single bag, leaving behind the hollow shell of her former life, the apartment that had become her tomb. She never went back. She cut off all contact with everyone who knew them both. She moved to a new city, changed her name, her hair, her entire appearance. She built a new identity from scratch, one that was sharp, angular, and difficult to mimic. But she is forever looking over her shoulder. Sometimes, in a crowd, she'll hear a laugh that is a little too familiar. Or she'll see a woman across the street with the same coat, the same walk. She knows that the void is still out there, hungry, and she knows that somewhere there is a version of Clara living a life that was supposed to be hers. A perfect copy, a ghost in the machine. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Your presence here gives strength to these warnings, ensuring they reach those who slumber next to their own private horrors. Let us now descend into a different kind of darkness, one not of the mind, but of the flesh. A story that whispers to me from a place of primal hunger and rot. I see a young medical student, Amir, a man of science and logic, who rented a room in a large creaking house owned by an older gentleman, Mr. Alistair. Mr. Alistair was a recluse, a gaunt figure who rarely left his private quarters on the top floor. His only requirement for his tenants was that they never, under any circumstances, go into the basement. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, a stark metallic warning in the otherwise decaying Victorian home. Amir, preoccupied with his studies, readily agreed. The basement was just a basement, after all. The house had a peculiar smell. It was a faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit and damp earth, with a sharp, metallic undertone that reminded Amir of an anatomy lab after a long day. He dismissed it as the signature scent of old age and disrepair, the perfume of a house slowly surrendering to entropy. The other tenants, a rotating cast of students and transient workers, seemed equally oblivious or unconcerned. They kept to themselves, respecting the unspoken rule of isolation that permeated the residence. But Amir, with his medical training, had a heightened sensitivity to the sense of life and decay, and the smell from the basement was growing stronger. It wasn't a constant odor. It would ebb and flow, sometimes barely noticeable, other times so thick it would catch in the back of his throat. It was strongest late at night, a sweet, sickly plume that seemed to rise through the floorboards, a ghostly exhalation from the house's forbidden lungs. It was during these nights that he would hear the sounds, a low, rhythmic humming, not from a machine, but something organic. It was a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to make the very air tremble. It was often followed by a wet, sloppy noise, like a large animal tearing at a carcass. Amir tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, a faulty generator, rats in the walls. But his scientific mind could not conjure an explanation that satisfied the primal fear coiling in his stomach. One day, a package was mistakenly delivered to Amir instead of Mr. Alistair. It was a long, heavy box from a medical supply company. Curiosity overriding his better judgment, Amir carefully slit the tape. Inside, nestled in foam, was not medical equipment, but rows upon rows of scalpels, bone saws, surgical tubing, and large industrial-grade meat hooks. A cold dread washed over him. Why would a reclusive old man need such instruments? He quickly resealed the box and left it outside Mr. Alistair's door, but the image was seared into his mind. The sweet smell, the wet sounds, the surgical tools, they were 3 points of a terrifying triangle, and he was standing right in the middle. His studies began to suffer. He found himself distracted, listening for the nightly sounds, trying to analyze the components of the awful smell. He noticed that Mr. Alistair never seemed to eat. No groceries were ever delivered. No cooking smells ever came from his rooms. Yet the man, though gaunt, did not appear malnourished. He moved with a strange, wiry energy when Amir caught rare glimpses of him on the stairs. He seemed sustained, fed by some unseen source. The tenants of the house came and went with unusual frequency. People would move in, stay for a few weeks, and then disappear overnight, their rooms left empty, sometimes with belongings still inside, as if they had fled in a great hurry. Amir started paying attention to the trash cans left out on the curb each week. Mr. Alistair's were always filled with heavy, tightly sealed black bags. One windy night, one of the bags tore open, spilling some of its contents onto the street. Amir, watching from his window, saw what looked like large, cleaned bones, too large to be from a chicken, too strangely shaped to be from a cow or pig. And there were strips of a strange, rubbery, pale material that he couldn't identify. Before he could investigate further, the old man emerged from the house with a frantic haste he had never seen before, quickly gathering the spilled contents and securing the bag, his shadowed eyes scanning the street as if searching for witnesses. The breaking point came on a sweltering summer night. The smell was unbearable, a thick, gagging miasma that filled the entire house. The sounds from the basement were louder than ever. The humming, the tearing, and now, a new sound, a soft, rhythmic dripping. Amir couldn't take it anymore. Logic had failed him. It was time for empirical evidence. He crept down the stairs to the basement door. The padlock was gone. In his haste, or his hunger, Mr. Alistair had forgotten to secure it. Amir's hand trembled as he reached for the cold, iron knob. A whisper from beyond urged him on. Some doors are meant to be opened, for knowledge is a hunger that must be fed. He turned the knob and pulled the heavy door inward. The wave of stench that hit him was a physical force, driving the air from his lungs. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, of an open grave. He flickered on the flashlight from his phone, its weak beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The floor was stained with old, dried blood. Meat hooks hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the draft from the open door. And in the center of the room was a large stainless steel table, the kind used for autopsies. On the table was the source of the sounds. It was a vast, pulsating mass of pale, quivering flesh. It was amorphous, vaguely organ-like, and covered in a network of thick, throbbing veins. Surgical tubes snaked from the mass into various buckets filled with a dark, viscous fluid. This thing was alive. It was the source of the humming, a low, resonant vibration that he could feel in the bones of his feet. As he watched, a section of the mass convulsed, and a long, fleshy tendril detached from the main body, falling onto the table with a wet slap. This was Mr. Alistair's sustenance. He was not a recluse. He was a farmer, a rancher, and this was his livestock. He was cultivating this living, regenerating tissue in his basement, harvesting it for food. The bones in the trash, the missing tenants, a horrifying, impossible conclusion began to form in Amir's mind. Was the raw material for this thing human? Was Alistair feeding it, to feed himself? Suddenly, the light from his phone cast a shadow on the far wall, a tall, gaunt shadow. Amir spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. Mr. Alistair stood in the doorway, his face illuminated from below by the phone's light, creating a horrifying death mask. His eyes were not angry, they were disappointed. In one hand, he held a long, freshly sharpened butcher's knife. "I did ask you not to come down here, my boy," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "The harvest is a delicate process. It does not like to be disturbed." The humming from the mass on the table grew louder, more agitated. It could sense the new presence, the new fear, the new meat. Amir didn't scream. The sound was trapped in his throat, a solid ball of ice. He bolted, not for the stairs, but deeper into the darkness of the basement, his scientific mind replaced by pure animal instinct. He scrambled over piles of old furniture and boxes, the old man's slow, deliberate footsteps following behind him. He found a small, grimy window high on the wall. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked it out, shattering the glass, and squeezed his body through the narrow opening, cutting himself on the jagged edges. He fell into the overgrown bushes of the backyard, and ran, never once looking back at the house where the old man tended to his unspeakable garden, forever sustained by his strange and terrible harvest. He knows even now that some hungers can never be satisfied, and that behind the most ordinary doors, the most unholy feasts are taking place. The walls of your home are not just structures, they are membranes. They are porous, breathing entities that absorb the emotions, the secrets, and the sins of those who dwell within. A place can become sick, infected by the darkness of an occupant, and that sickness can spread. Have you ever felt a cold spot in a perfectly warm room, or heard a whisper when no one is there? It is not a ghost from a bygone era. It is the psychic residue of the living, the emotional stain of a person whose soul has begun to decay. And like any decay, it has a smell, it has a sound, it has a presence, and it is looking for a new host. I am now shown a vision of a place of deep cold, a story not of flesh, but of spirit. The whispers tell of a young couple, Maya and Ben, who moved into their first apartment, a charming pre-war duplex. They were ecstatic. To save money, they took on a roommate, a quiet woman in her late 30s named Annalise. She was a librarian, she said, who valued order and silence. She seemed perfect. Her room was at the end of the hall, and she kept to herself, a ghost in their new life. The first few weeks were peaceful, but then the cold began. It started in the hallway outside her door, a patch of air that was always unnaturally frigid, a cold that sank into your bones. Ben and Maya assumed it was a draft, a quirk of the old building. They put a rug down, a draft stopper under Annalise's door, but the cold remained, a permanent pocket of winter in their home. It began to spread. Soon, the entire hallway was perpetually chilled. Then the living room. It was like a slow, invisible glacier was creeping out from Annalise's room, claiming the apartment inch by inch. They would have to wear sweaters indoors, even as the sun blazed outside. Their heating bills skyrocketed, but it made no difference. The cold was not a temperature, it was a presence. It had a weight, a texture. It felt like walking through invisible icy cobwebs. Annalise herself seemed unaffected. She would walk through the frigid rooms in a thin house dress, her skin pale and clammy, but her expression serene. When they asked her if she felt the chill, she would simply smile a thin, bloodless smile and say, "I've always been comfortable in the quiet and the cool." Her room was the epicenter, the heart of the winter. Maya, driven by a growing unease, once touched the doorknob to Annalise's room. It was so cold it felt like it burned her skin, leaving a red mark on her palm. She snatched her hand back, as if she'd touched dry ice. There was a power emanating from that room, an energy that was actively leaching the warmth from the world around it. The plants in the apartment began to die. First, the delicate ferns, then the hardy succulents. Their leaves would turn black and brittle overnight, as if flash frozen. Food in the kitchen would spoil at an accelerated rate. Milk would curdle, bread would mold in a day. The apartment was becoming a zone of accelerated entropy, a place where life and warmth were being systematically extinguished. Maya and Ben's relationship began to suffer. The constant cold made them irritable, on edge. They argued constantly, the warmth between them draining away, replaced by a sullen, resentful chill. The apartment was making them cold on the inside, too. One night, Ben woke up shivering violently. The bedroom was arctic. He looked over at Maya and saw that her lips were blue. Frost had formed on the window panes, on the inside. But the most terrifying thing was the figure standing in the doorway of their bedroom. It was Annalise. She was just standing there, a motionless silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. She wasn't looking at them, but past them, at the wall behind their bed. She stood there for a full minute, silent and still, radiating an aura of profound, deathly cold. Then, as silently as she appeared, she retreated down the hall. Ben, shaking with more than just the cold, woke Maya, and they huddled together under the blankets, too afraid to sleep. The next day, they decided they had to get her out. They couldn't explain it, but they knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was the cause. She was a human cold spot, a psychic vampire who fed not on blood, but on heat, on life, on happiness. Ben went to speak with her. He knocked on her door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the chilled silence. There was no answer. He called her name. Nothing. Finally, mustering his courage, he tried the knob. It was unlocked. The cold that billowed out when he opened the door was staggering. It was the air of a tomb, of a deep, sunless cave. The room was bare, not just tidy, but utterly sterile. There was a bed, neatly made, a small dresser, no pictures, no books, no personal effects. It was the room of someone who didn't exist, and on the wall, the one she had been staring at the night before, was a single large, dark stain. It was a patch of black mold, but it was growing in a strange, almost deliberate pattern, like a spreading frost flower or a dark, frozen nerve cluster. In the center of the stain, the plaster was cracked and crumbling away. Ben reached out and touched the wall. It was colder than ice, and it seemed to vibrate with a low, hungry energy. He could feel it, pulling the warmth from his fingertips, from his body. He pulled back the crumbling plaster. Behind it was not the expected brick or lath, but a hollow space. And in that space was an old, leather-bound book. He pulled it out. It was a diary. The dates went back over 100 years. It belonged to a woman named Annalise. It described her life in this very apartment, her loneliness, her despair after the death of her child in a harsh winter. The final entry was chilling. I can no longer feel the sun. The world is warm, but I am a vessel of ice. I will give myself to the cold, to the quiet. I will make this place my own. I will wait in the walls for someone to share my winter. Ben dropped the book. Annalise wasn't a librarian. She wasn't even their roommate. She was a ghost who had been waiting in the cold, hollow space behind the wall. The real Annalise, the one they had rented the room to, had likely been her first victim, a person whose identity the spirit had borrowed. She had probably fled in terror, just as they were about to. The entity was a hungry cold, a grief so profound it had become a paranormal force, an entity that fed on the warmth of the living to sustain its own eternal winter. They had been living with a memory, a sorrow that had grown so powerful it could manifest, could speak, could sign a lease. They had invited a localized, supernatural ice age into their home. They fled that day, leaving the cold apartment and the diary behind. They didn't care about their deposit, their belongings. They just needed to be warm again. They moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment on the other side of town, and slowly the feeling returned to their lives. But they are forever changed. They are haunted by the memory of that unnatural cold. Sometimes, on a winter's night, Maya will swear she feels a sudden chill in the room, and she and Ben will look at each other with a shared, unspoken terror. They know that some sorrows don't fade. They just wait. They wait in the walls, in the quiet, in the cold, for a new source of heat. Do you understand now? The true horror is not always what a person does, but what a person is, what they carry inside them, what they can bring into your home without ever unpacking a single box. Let us turn our gaze to the final vision. This one is different. It is not about theft, or hunger, or cold. It is about a door that should never have been opened, and a sound that should never have been heard. This is the story of Marcus, a musician who needed a cheap place to live and practice. He found a room in a sprawling, slightly dilapidated house shared by a group of artists and night shift workers. His roommate, a man named Elias, occupied the room directly above his. Elias was a writer, a man who kept nocturnal hours and was rarely seen. The only evidence of his existence was the constant rhythmic sound from his room, the clacking of an old-fashioned typewriter. At first, the sound was comforting to Marcus. It was the noise of creation, a kindred spirit working through the night. The steady tap 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 became the metronome to his own musical compositions. It was a predictable, stable presence in the chaotic household. But after a few weeks, Marcus began to notice something strange about the typing. It never stopped. Not for a minute. It went on, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The rhythm was flawless, impossibly consistent. There were no pauses for thought, no breaks for rest, no changes in speed or cadence. It was as relentless and inhuman as the ticking of a clock. Marcus mentioned it to the other housemates. They shrugged. "That's just Elias," one said. "He's dedicated." But their eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, an unease they tried to hide. No one had actually seen Elias in weeks. Food left outside his door would disappear, and rent money would appear under the landlord's door. But the man himself was a phantom. The only proof he was still there was the ceaseless mechanical clatter of the keys from above. The sound began to burrow into Marcus's brain. It was the first thing he heard when he woke up and the last thing he heard before he fell into a fitful sleep. He started trying to decipher the rhythm, looking for patterns, for a message in the monotonous noise. But there was none. It was a perfect, unbroken stream of characters, a river of text flowing from some inexhaustible source. It was maddening. It was the sound of infinity, and it was happening right above his head. His own music began to suffer. He couldn't compose. The relentless typing drowned out every melody in his mind. It was a sonic invasion, an occupation of his creative space. He started wearing earplugs, then noise-canceling headphones, but he could still feel the vibrations through the ceiling, a ghostly tapping against his skull. One night, a fuse blew, plunging the house into darkness and silence. For the first time in months, the typing stopped. The sudden, absolute quiet was more jarring and terrifying than the noise had ever been. Marcus sat in the dark, his ears ringing, every nerve on edge. 10 minutes passed. 20. The silence was a held breath. Then, from the floor above, came a new sound, a single, guttural, inhuman roar of frustration and rage. It was a sound of pure agony, as if a machine had been brutally ripped from its power source. It was followed by a crash, the sound of a heavy object being thrown against a wall. Then, silence again. A moment later, the power came back on, and instantly, the typing resumed, as if nothing had ever happened. Marcus was now consumed by a terrifying obsession. Who or what was Elias? No human could type for that long without rest. No human would react to a power outage with such primal fury. He had to know what was in that room. He began watching the door, hoping to catch a glimpse of the phantom writer. He saw nothing. He tried talking to him through the door, but his words were swallowed by the incessant clatter. The sound was a wall, a fortress, protecting a secret he was now certain was something monstrous. The writer was no longer a creator. He was a prisoner or a warden of that terrible, endless sound. Finally, he could bear it no longer. He found the landlord and voiced his concerns, his frantic, sleep-deprived theories about what was happening in the room upstairs. The landlord, a weary, indifferent man, just sighed. "The man pays his rent. He doesn't make a mess. Leave him be." But Marcus was persistent, relentless. He threatened to call the police, to report a missing person. Finally, the landlord relented, producing a master key. "Fine," he grumbled. "Let's go see the great author at work." They climbed the stairs, the sound of the typewriter growing louder, more aggressive, as if it sensed their approach. It was a sound that did not want to be interrupted. The landlord knocked. "Elias? It's me, just checking in." The typing continued, unabated. He knocked again, harder. Elias, open the door. Nothing. With a final exasperated sigh, he slid the key into the lock. The moment the door swung open, the typing stopped. The silence crashed down on them again, heavy and absolute. The room was filled with paper. Stacks of it reached the ceiling. It covered the floor, the bed, the furniture. Every single page was filled from top to bottom with a single repeating sentence, over and over and over again, in perfect, flawless type. I must not stop the noise. I must not stop the noise. I must not stop the noise. And in the center of the room, slumped over an ancient black typewriter, was a body. It was desiccated, mummified. It was little more than a skeleton draped in dry, leathery skin and tattered clothes. The coroner would later determine that the man Elias had been dead for at least 6 months. But that was impossible. The typing had only stopped seconds ago. As Marcus stared in horror, he saw it. The man's hands were not on the keys. They were curled into stiff claws in his lap, but the keys, one of them was still moving. The tie key was depressing and rising on its own with a faint, ghostly click, click, click. The typewriter was typing by itself. It was the source, the entity. It had needed a host, a witness, an audience to fuel its endless, meaningless work. Elias hadn't been a writer. He had been a battery. He had sat there, day after day until he had died, and the machine had simply kept going, feeding on the residual energy of the space, on the attention of those who could hear it. The roar Marcus had heard during the blackout was the machine's rage. The silence now was its sulking. It had been discovered. As they watched, the keys began to move again, slowly at first, then picking up speed, returning to their frantic, relentless pace, clattering away in the empty, silent room. I must not stop the noise. I must not stop the noise. Marcus moved out that day, but he never escaped the sound. He hears it still in the quiet moments, a faint, phantom typing in the back of his mind. He can no longer create music. Every melody is consumed by that relentless, monotonous rhythm. He learned the most terrible truth of all. Sometimes, the horror is not the person in the other room. It is the room itself. It is the objects within it. It is the patterns, the sounds, the routines that take on a life of their own, that wear a human name like a mask, and continue their work long after the human host has turned to dust and cold ashes. We have walked together through these shadowed hallways. We have peeked behind the closed doors and listened to the whispers that travel through the walls. You came here seeking stories, a brief, thrilling chill to punctuate the quiet of your evening. But the truth is, the stories are not over. You carry them with you now. The seeds of these visions have been planted in the fertile soil of your imagination. The next time you hear a strange sound from your roommate's room, you will remember the endless typewriter. The next time you feel a sudden, inexplicable chill, you will remember the woman made of grief and winter. You are no longer just a listener. You are now a witness. Look around the space you inhabit. Look at the person you share it with. Do you see the cracks in their mirror? Do you smell the faint scent of decay beneath their perfume? Do you feel the subtle drain on your own energy? You have been warned. The membrane between your reality and their abyss is thinner than you could ever imagine. A creaking door is no longer just a sound. It is a question. A shadow that moves is no longer a trick of the light. It is an answer. You have been given the gift of sight, the burden of knowledge. Use it. Listen to the whispers. Trust the cold feeling on the back of your neck. For the greatest monster is the one you pay half the rent to. The one who smiles at you over breakfast while sharpening a knife in the private dark room of their soul. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let the echoes know in the space below. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Do not let it fade to silence.